set between the years of 1897 and 1903. And the chapter I'm going to read you takes place in 1898, right after the sinking of the Maine, and in Havana Harbor, but before President McKinley decided to declare war on the Spanish. So there's this several months where we didn't know if we were, you know, it was only conjecture that the Spanish were behind the sinking of the Maine. And it took a lot of issues of William Randolph Hearst and you know, New York papers, the yellow journalists, to convince people and put pressure on McKinley to actually declare war. At this point in the book, you've met several of the soldiers in the 25th Infantry, which was a so-called colored regiment back then, which would be regular Army guys where everybody above sergeant was white and everybody below sergeant below were black. And the 25th has been sent from their posting in Fort Missoula down to Camp Chickamauga in northern Georgia, which was just a park until we decided to fight against Spain, or decided we might have to fight against Spain. And the 25th is being held there along with a bunch of white regular regiments, as well as lots of volunteer regiments. The standing army that the United States had at the time was very small. So when this opportunity of having a war, which the young people were very excited about, came up, every state raised a volunteer unit, usually with elected officers, usually prominent citizens in their communities, and not necessarily people with any military you know, background or experience or skill. So of course, this chapter is about baseball. Our boys at camp. The game is friendly till the ladies arrive. The 12th are regulars, at least, though Sergeant Jacks is convinced their mountsman is a ringer, snuck in from the Atlanta pro team after the officers made their wagers. He has a smoking fastball and a wicked late hooking curve that has the right-handed batters back on their heels and popping up. It has stayed tight only because the boys he's picked for the outfield, especially Scott in center, cover their ground at a gallop and rifle the ball to the proper base when the white team makes a hit. Private Coleman, who they call Too Tall, has been adequate in the box, but is starting to tire from whipping fastball after fastball over the batter's slab. Don't you have a change of pace, son? Sergeant Jacks asks him when he trots forward from second after calling timeout. Of course I do, the veteran answers. I'll roll the ball to the catcher. What I thought. How's your arm? Too Tall spits tobacco, works his shoulder a few times, cocking his head as if listening to something inside the muscle. Won't be able to lift her tomorrow, he says, but now she's fine. Jacks nods and moves back to his position. They are down 4 runs to 2, a runner on third and a single out. A couple hundred of the 12th are gathered along the first base line, cheering their batter, a big sunburned boy with a dent in his nose, while an equal contingent of the 25th urge Coleman on from the third base side. Colonel Burt and his rival sit together with some other officers and the sheriff from Lytle and the other dignitaries on a little set of bleachers that has been set up, sipping whiskey from tin mess cups and enjoying the contest like plantation lords, while the rest of the cracker civilians over from town are either clumped behind home pulling for the whites or scattered in the outfield, moving out of the way or becoming obstacles depending on which team's ball is in play. It is dusty as ever, but enough breeze to keep the flies from settling on you. Jacks tries to spit, but can't make enough water. The batter, over-swinging, fouls the first 2 pitchers off, and as they are playing the old rule, there is no count against him. Coleman has been throwing for 7 innings now, putting the mustard on every pitch, and it's clear the white boys aren't afraid of him anymore. Come on, pitch, Jacks calls, adding his voice to the infield chatter. Throw that pellet past him. Coleman delivers high and wide for a ball. The 25th was the first unit to arrive at the Chickamauga camp, helping to clear new roads in the park to dig the near useless wells. Then the other regulars started coming, and finally the state volunteers with their swagger and their suspicion and their amateur officers. There are too many men here and not enough for them to do, and if something doesn't change soon, the flies are going to win the campaign. Combat will be no problem. Combat keeps them occupied, but this, a hodgepodge of units waiting for orders, regulars and volunteers all mixed together under the pines, their sentries challenging each other for the pure spite of it, Lytle, a hellhole for the colored troops, and Chattanooga, if you've got time to spare, not much budget. Missoula was pie, the town used to them, friendly even, cheering them into the trains and telling them to be sure to come back. But the reception has cooled with every mile further south traveled, and they are still only to the very top of Georgia. Short of combat, of course, a ball game is always the best way to let off some steam. Even better if you win. Too Tall bounces him off the plate for another ball. "Bear down, big man, bear down," calls Jax, taking a step back into the shallow outfield. "Let the run score, just get the out." It is then that the ladies appear, a good dozen of them in pastel dresses and parasols, a lane parting among the white spectators, chatting with each other as they walk without a glance to the field, confident that play will be suspended till they are settled. Too Tall just looks at the ball in his hand, rolling it around as if counting the stitches in the cover, and most of the others break out of their crouches and kick at the uneven pasture, waiting. But Dade at first base, who is from Rhode Island of all places, puts his hands on his hips and stands gawking at them like an idiot. The tin cups disappear, and the officers jump up to be gallant, smoothing their mustaches and brushing off the boards so the ladies may be seated. From the corner of his eye, Jax can tell that these aren't camp followers or sporting gals, but the cream of whatever Chattanooga claims for society. He checks the sky for rain. The umpire, a second lieutenant from headquarters staff with a whimsical sense of what qualifies as a strike, waits until the last parasol is positioned before starting again. "Let's play ball," he calls out, "and mind your language." Coleman puts a strike past the batter then, grunting as he releases the ball, and Jax can tell he's hurt. It's the first time the whole regiment has been together in years. Each company has voted 2 men to make up the squad, forgetting that pitching is half the game. His only left-hander, Gamble, is in the sick tent with dysentery, and Ham Robinson mustered out a week before the main blew up. The next delivery is low and wide, but the 12th man swings anyway, dribbling it foul off the top of the bat. The ball rolls dead at the feet of one of the young ladies in the bleachers, the others twittering as she picks it up and holds it as if it may bite her. Before any of the officers can relieve her of it, that fool of a Yankee first baseman, Dade, steps right up and plucks it out of her hand. It gets too quiet then. He's a pretty boy, Dade, buff-colored with reddish hair, and he smiles to show the blonde girl his gold tooth, tips his hat, and drops back to the field. Nothing happens right away, but Jax can feel a change in the air, like it gets in the Gulf in Texas before a big blow, back stiffening among the local crackers behind home, an edge to the cheering from the men of the 12th standing on the sideline. Too Tall throws again, wincing, and Jax doesn't like the sound when the batter lays into the ball. He turns, expecting the worst, but there is Scott, backed up, deep in center, the boy waiting, then charging a few steps forward to catch the ball and winging it in on the fly, Jax letting it sizzle past him to skip off the front of the mound and continue to the catcher, so quick the runner is 4 feet from home when he's tagged. Double out, inning over. The whole regiment lets out a Comanche whoop then, slapping the Carolina boy in the back when he comes in from the field, sharing out a sack of oranges somebody has foraged. Water at the camp is not much for drinking, boiled and allowed to settle till it tastes like mud. So even hot from the sun, the orange soothes his throat. "I took something off him," says Too Tall. "I know he's going to pop up." The pop-up would have been out of reach in any fenced ballpark Jax has ever played in. But he leads off the inning and can't deal with the pitching now. He digs in at the plate, splits his grip on the bat for control, and watches the white boy's legs. His fastball still has too much pop to do much with, but his curve is a lot slower and starting to break earlier. In his windup for the curve, he twists his hip and swings his lead leg across his body, almost stiff at the knee, while he bends the knee and lifts it high for the straight pitch. Jax waits for a curve. "Come on, Sarge," calls Cooper, not playing, but plenty active on the sideline. "I got some serious paper on the line." Laughter from the men then. There is no cash left at the camp. Soldiers writing pretend checks to each other in their card games and charging what little there is to buy at the colored canteen against next month's pay. Jax waits out 2 fast ones, a strike and a ball. On the next throw, the hurler keeps his lead leg stiff, and Jack steps back while he's still in motion, waiting on the ball, then slapping it hard between the shortstop and third baseman. "Atta go, Sarge! Run around board!" The pitcher has a good quick throw to first and has almost caught them napping a couple times. Jax hasn't stolen a base in 10 years and stays close to the bag, while Curtis strikes out on a pitch in the dirt. Del Spicer, who married the Blackfoot gal back in Montana, comes up then and swings late on the first pitch, slicing it just bare off the first base boundary and has been laid down with line. It gets lost in the spectators who complicate things by trying to help, and Jax ends up at third with Spicer standing up at second. The umpire makes both of them move back a base, claiming interference. Jax knows it will do no good, but needs to make a show for the boys, calling time and stomping over to complain. They hadn't grabbed it, would have rolled for a triple. The umpire is in military uniform. He taps his second lieutenant's bar. All decisions final. Jax returns to second with the white side of the field catcalling after him. Horace Bell from B Company is up now, the swiftest of their runners, but not much with the bat. Jack sees the 12th infield playing back and signals for a bunt. "Good look now," he calls, catching Bell's eye and tugging twice on his cap. "Wait for your pitch." But the curve snaps in on his hands and hits the neck of the bat before he can pull it back, popping up easily to the catcher. Jax calls time again and has them wake up Sergeant Lumley, who's been snoozing in the shade under the bench. Lum can't run anymore on account of a bullet he took in the knee during a scrap in Bozeman, but he can grit his teeth and march the boots off most of the boys. And with a hickory club in his hands, well, the big sergeant steps up to the plate, a pattern of field grass dented into one side of his face, squinting sleepily and looking around the bases. He hasn't been awake enough to know what stuff the pitcher has got, but with Lum, it's never mattered much. "Strike this darky out," hollers one of the locals, and Lum turns to stare at him as the first pitch sails over for a strike. The Crackers laugh. Lum turns his sleepy gaze back to the pitcher then, and knocks the next one over the left fielder's head, and it just rolls and rolls. Rolls so far that 2 runs score, and Lumley is able to quick march all the way to third before they get the ball back in. Jack sends a runner to take his place, and Lum returns to the bench, rubbing his eyes. "We headed behind?" he asks. "Tied." "What inning?" "Top of the 8th. "Dang." He looks up at the sun. "This day done slipped by me." Shavers bounces out, and they take the field, Jack's walking out next to his pitcher. "Can you do this?" Too Tall spits tobacco. "I keep it low." The first batter up for the 12th is a pinch hitter too, a long-limbed drip of water who has been corked black wherever his skin shows out from the uniform. The Crackers behind the catcher think this is a riot, and the boy cooms it up, dragging the bat to the plate, dangling his loose limbs like rubber, turning to doff his cap, revealing a shock of yellow hair, and bow to the ladies, who cover their mouths as they giggle. "Send one to the moon, rascals," calls the sheriff through cupped hands. "I surely do my best, sir," he answers, bugging his eyes wide. He walks with his buttocks stuck out and arched high, and waggles them to great amusement as he settles in at the place. "Send me the sauce, boss," he calls to Coleman. It is bad enough down here in this shithole Georgia not knowing if there's going to be a war or not, or if there is, will they be allowed to go, and wearing the damn woolen tunics in this heat while you drill, and then what's supposed to be your own people who you're fighting for treat you like dirt every time you wander off the reservation. Jack sees it coming. Jack sees it coming in the way Coleman holds his body and the way he grips the ball. and he just stands at his position and says nothing. Too Tall sends one upstairs, and the black-faced boy hits the dirt. It is dead quiet for a long moment. "Ball one," calls the second lieutenant, and gives Jax a look. The Crackers and a good number of the boys from the 12th are screaming as he walks to the mound this time, faces red, a few stepping across the line onto the infield to make their threats. He hears nigger this and nigger that, something about when the sun goes down. The 12th are regulars, good outfit, but the pastel ladies are here now, and it changes everything. Both the colonels are standing up in the bleachers, looking concerned. Jax kicks the ball from Too Tall. "You don't really have nothing left, do you?" "S'pose not," the pitcher says, turning to spit tobacco, face amasked as the Crackers shout. "If I still had it, I'd have tore that boy's head off." "You walk straight for the middle of our fellas over there. Keep your eyes to yourself. I can get these bastards out. You've done enough today, trooper. Nice job." The private walks extra slow to the waiting wall of blue shirts, tucking his glove under his arm and seeming not to notice his life is being threatened by the mob on the other side. Jax waves for Hooks to go in at center and brings Scott in to take the mound. The word is that the Carolina boy can throw it some, and at this point he wishes Colonel Burt would step down and run the damn team like he did when they played the Railroaders in Missoula. "Get us through this inning alive," Sergeant Jax says to Scott as he hands the ball over, looking him hard in the eye. "You know what I mean." The boy, Royal is his first name, gives him a big grin. "Sure thing, Sarge." He takes his time getting ready, strolling over to say something to Corporal Ponder at third base, and giving him his glove. Ponder trots to the bench, whispers something to the one they call Mudfish, and returns with a different one. The crowd, impatient, are shouting for action as Scott puts this one on. He winks to the second lieutenant behind the plate. "This is my pitching glove," he says. He asks for a couple warm-up throws then, which brings a new howl of protest from the white side, and proceeds to out-coon the batter, windmilling his arm in an elaborate wind-up, catching the return throws behind his back, like the boys do when they're just fooling among themselves. The white folks aren't sure what to make of it, and neither is his own side, but the burnt court boy looks a little embarrassed now, waiting to take his turn. "Batter up," calls the second lieutenant. Jax crouches and pounds his glove. Scott rears back and throws hard overhand, only he doesn't let go of the ball. Instead, wheeling off the mound and striding over to the bench, the 12 men and the locals catcalling again as he gets his original glove back from Mudfish. "Sorry, sir," he calls to the umpire as he takes the mound again. "Just didn't feel right." The minstrel boy digs in, looking pissed off to have the attention of the crowd pulled away from his antics. "You ain't gonna need a glove if you just throw me that thing," he says. "You're gonna need binoculars to follow where it's going." "Coming right out," smiles Scott, and goes into his windmilling wind-up. The pitch he lobs in is so fat, Jax could run to the sidelines, grab a bat, and still get to the plate in time to hit it. The white boy in the black face takes a mighty swing, connecting with it square over the plate. But instead of a crack of wood, there is a heavy, soggy thump, the ball flying apart into 100 little bits that spray outward like a fireworks explosion. Jax is hit on the shoulder with a piece of it, a wet scrap of orange, peel made white from the lime from the base paths. People are stunned at first, minds taking a moment to grasp the phenomenon. Then the whole 25th falls out laughing, whacking each other on the back and miming the batter's dumbfounded reaction. Even a few of the white folks join in, the white ladies clapping their little gloved hands with delight. The second lieutenant, though, is not smiling as he steps to the mound. "Let's cut out the nigger show and play ball." "Nigger show's at the plate, sir," Scott tells him, nodding toward the batter, who is looking sheepish and still picking flecks of orange from his front. "You gonna get serious," says the officer, "or do I call a forfeit?" "Yes, sir." Corporal Ponder tosses Scott the real ball. "I will seriously strike this coon out," and proceeds to put the side down with only 9 pitches, in-shoots and drop-offs, fastballs that seem to hop at the last moment, and a big roundhouse curve that starts out heading halfway between home and third before hooking back over the heart of the plate. the regiment whooping louder after every strike. The last man to whiff slams his bat down in frustration, and Jax hurries to join Scott as they leave the field. Don't smile, don't wave your hat, he says, just walk off. Of course, Scott is the first batter up to begin the ninth. The pitcher gives him a long look and then throws a steaming fastball into his ribs. There was a sound like the orange exploding, and Scott drops to his knees, and then it is very quiet again. If this was two white teams or two colored teams, it would just be baseball, part of the game. And if there was a fight with nobody sent to the hospital, they'd all meet at the canteen to compare bruises over beer and pretzels. But instead, Jax and Mingo Sanders have to grab Cooper to keep him from running across the field. And the officers are out of the bleacher, waving their arms to keep the regiments apart. And the crackers are asking Scott if he thinks he's so damn smart now. And when the whistles start blowing, Jax thinks it's the provost guard come to make some arrests. But there is Colonel Daggett, with a quartet of majors around him, marching up onto the mound. And in a flash, the junior officers and non-coms have their people in formation. Baseball uniforms scattered among the blue. The 25th formed on the third base side of the field, and the 12th on the first. And Daggett waits till even the civilians are on their feet and silent before he speaks. I've just received a wire from Washington, he says, and it applies to both regiments present. We have orders to break camp, pending transport to Tampa. The Congress has voted, and it is on, gentlemen. A cheer erupts on both sides of the field. Hats fill the air. The ladies in the bleachers spin their parasols in excitement. The game has begun. So the 25th had a lot of adventures after that. They ended up fighting in Cuba at El Caney, or El Caney if you're Cuban, the hill right next to San Juan Hill, and then were dispersed and then reformed again and fought in the Philippine-American War. Anybody have any questions about this big book, or anything that happens in it, or anything else? Anybody? Yes?
I'm not too far into the book. I've read a couple of days, but I noticed the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, plays a big part, and maybe it becomes clear in the course of the book, but I was wondering why Wilmington.
Yeah, Wilmington, Royal Scott, who's the guy who comes and pitches this, and his friend Junior Lunsford are both from Wilmington. What happened in Wilmington, the two major arcs of the book, for me, one is the end of Reconstruction. North Carolina was the last of the former Confederate states to bring in the Jim Crow laws and disenfranchise the black men who'd been able to vote since the Civil War. And they did that by having a racial coup with a Gatling gun mounted on the back of a wagon involved and a lot of skullduggery, and then put in a grandfather clause. So if your grandfather hadn't voted, you didn't get to vote, and that was pretty much the end of Reconstruction as it's understood. And that ties through race to the other major thrust of the book, which is about the Philippine-American War, which is really, it's not the first time we here in the United States acted in an imperialist way. We certainly had taken over Indian nations before and a big chunk of Mexico. But it's the first time we started to think of ourselves as imperialists, and there was such a quick 180 that happened within like 2 months. We got into the Cuban part of the Spanish-American War as a kind of pro bono. We're doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. We love liberty, and we can't stand anybody else to be deprived of their liberty, especially not in our hemisphere. So we're going to go and kick the dirty Dagos out of Cuba, where they've been for hundreds of years, and liberate the Cuban people, which I have to say needed doing. The Cubans were really, really suffering under the Spanish. There are pictures of people from concentration camps, campos reconcentrados, that looked like people from Auschwitz, and that's part of what the yellow journalists did to get people into the idea of having a war with Spain. And then somehow, a couple months later, there we were in the Philippines killing Filipinos for control of their country. Having had a 1.5-day war with the Spanish that was rigged by the generals on both sides to save the honor of the Spanish, and marching right through the Philippine lines where they, surrounded the Spanish forces in Manila, in the walled city of Manila. And we marched in, raised the American flag, turned our guns around, and said to the Filipinos, any one of you that tries to enter your own capital city will be shot. And within a half a year, we were at war with the Filipinos. And there was a huge expansionist, proudly imperialist faction in the United States, and then kind of recalcitrant anti-imperialist faction. The most famous people in the Anti-Imperialist League, which had that name, were Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie. And there were congressional hearings after the war had been going for a while. It's where we learned waterboarding. It was called the water cure back then, and that was one of the things that got into the Library of Congress because there were hearings about that. So Wilmington is kind of what's happening for the African American troops while they're off fighting for the American flag, and many of them thinking this is going to raise us as a race in the eyes of white America. The rights that they had were being taken away. The title of the book, A Moment in the Sun, is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's quoted as, said, the Negro enjoyed a moment in the sun after the Civil War and then was dragged back into slavery, talking about when those Jim Crow laws and that disenfranchisement happened.
Excuse me, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll get you the mic so everyone can hear the question. So, up front here.
Hi, did you write the standing up?
Did I write this standing up? My back is kind of funky, and so I try to change positions about every hour. So I'll write for an hour or two sitting down. I have a kneeler, and I'll kneel down and I'll write. I do write standing up sometimes. But this book was written kind of on the road. We were doing publicity for Honey Dripper, and a lot of it was written in airports. If you've traveled domestically lately, about a third of our flights were canceled or delayed. And so there you are in the Winston-Salem airport for 6 hours more than you thought you would be. And so you write a little and you get up and you go somewhere else and change your position and write a little bit more. I can write I'm very lucky that I can write anywhere, longhand or in a computer or whatever. I was saying before about how long it's been between books. My last novel also came right after there was a Writers Guild of America, which is the Screenwriters Union strike. I had thought about writing this and written a few chapters and some outlining, and then it sat there for several years where I did movie stuff. And then the strike happened right at the same time we were doing this publicity. And so I'd say about 90% of the book was written in that 8-month strike period when I was unemployed.
I'm going to be reading it soon, I promise. I just saw the Honey Dripper in Portland, Oregon, and a message from Portland. Are you going to be in Portland, Oregon soon? My sister asked. Or were you just there?
I was just there a week or so ago.
She missed you. Okay.
She missed me.
Just wanted to know, when you're using the, I wouldn't call it a convention, but the plot line involving this baseball.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book called The Given Day that uses baseball within that framework of the story. And I've always appreciated baseball, but just from your reading, I think that I'm starting to see baseball in a whole new way. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think sports and music have been the places where the races and ethnicities in America have gotten together, not without some difficulty, but that's often the meeting place, the first place that people get together. And certainly, you know, the history of baseball in some ways is also the history of America with its own, you know, kind of segregated period and then its integrated period. And now, you know, as more Spanish-speaking people are moving to the United States, you know, the big leagues, half of their stars are Latino ball players. It is, I think, the easiest sport to write about in a way, because there's so much time in it. People stop, they make decisions. It's not a running game like basketball or soccer with a time period. So, you know, there's a great bit of footage. There was a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates who was in the World Series, who then the next year he kind of blew up and never really had much of a career after that, named Steve Blass. And you can see him as the last inning of a very tight game in the World Series where he could like win the whole thing for his team. And he walks out on the mound and you see him just stand and turn around 360 degrees and look at the crowd and take a little walk around the mound. And he said, I realized I might never be here again, and I wanted to enjoy the moment. You don't get to do that in basketball or football or whatever. So I think it's one of the reasons there are so many good novels that have some baseball in them or about it.
Was this always intended as a novel, or did you start writing as a screenplay, or?
Yeah, I wrote a screenplay many years ago called Sometime in the Sun, which only really followed the strain in the book about Royal Scott going from Wilmington to Cuba and the Philippines. Now there's like at least 3 other major characters who I added. I wrote the screenplay, I liked it. We scouted around where to shoot it. Went to the Philippines, you know, did some research about shooting there and looking at places, and then just realized there's no way in hell we'll ever get anybody to give us enough money to make this movie well. So it just sat for 3 or 4 years, and then I just had the idea one day, you know, I always felt like I was cramming too much into, even with just that one character story, into a 2-hour, 10-minute movie. And if I made it to a novel, maybe it would expand a little bit. And so when I started writing it, it did start to expand, and I just kept feeling like, oh, you know, there's some other place I would go, you know, this guy can't get in there, or he wouldn't be there, or whatever. And so I started coming up with these new major characters. And so eventually what the book ended up being was maybe 4 or 5 main characters traveling parallel to each other at first, and then they start to cross paths. Rather than going like that, they start to interweave a little bit. And that's happened before. A couple of my movies have been based on either short stories that I've written or a 4 to 8 page section in a novel. And occasionally I've written screenplays that just didn't work, and then I turned them back into a book or short story. When I sit down, I hope to know what form it's in, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Thank you.
It seems that being an author is a solitary thing, and being a director is just the opposite. I just wondered what your feelings were about the two.
Yeah, they both have their advantages. The great advantage of writing fiction is that you're basically God. You know, if you want it to be sunny, it's sunny. I can't do that in real life. You know, if you want there to be 5,000 troopers and you say, you know, their boots were dusty, all 5,000 of them have boots. Whereas if you're making a movie, you know, the costume person's going to say, you know, we don't have the budget for 5,000 boots, much less 5,000 troopers. So there's not those practical considerations that, you know, you have to deal with when you're telling a story in a movie. On the other hand, there's just you. I had an editor on this from McSweeney's, Jordan Bass, and I had a good time, you know, kind of going back and forth with him, but he's not a writer. So a lot of what we did was move text around, you know. just try this chapter in front of that, within the what we could do chronologically, given the history of what actually happened. And then he actually did say once or twice, I think we need a new chapter here, which was really great to hear from somebody editing a book that was already over 900 pages. But in a movie, the great thing is, yes, you have all these practical problems. If it's raining, you can't stop it by just saying the sun came out. But you have all these other people who can do things that you can't do. And that's what a director does. You direct other people's talents. And you may suggest things, but you're suggesting things to people who know things that you don't and have done things that you don't. So you have a cinematographer, you have a costumer, you have a production designer, you have a composer. And what I get to do is start them off on a path. This is the kind of thing I want. And then usually just say, bring me 3 or 4 choices, not much more than that. And then you get to say, oh, the second one or the third one. I think that really works for us. And then the actors bring something to it. Even if they, in the case of my movies, they don't get to change the dialogue, but they can come up with an interpretation of it. And the first thing I try to do as a director is see how the actor's going to do it. And it may be something I hadn't thought of. And that I like even better than what I had thought of. So there is, there are those kind of pros and cons to both of them. The tough thing with movies is it costs money. And so I've got all kinds of great movies I'd love to make, but nobody's ever going to give us the money to do it. So much of the job for me in filmmaking is figuring out how much money I could possibly scrape together, and then what can I do well for that? What can I figure out that's going to be a movie I really want to make and that I think some people will want to see for the limited, resources that we have. Whereas with a book, you can write about anything.
I once assigned you a book about making a major one and how to make movies. And one of the smartest things I thought you said that works for all films, I think, was that you really make your movie in pre-production.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if there's an analog here for writing novels. Do you spend a lot of time structuring what you're going to say, or is it kind of a flowing day-by-day experience?
Yeah, I think with The Moment in the Sun, the good thing about, another good thing about writing fiction is it only costs you the time and the paper and the ink. It doesn't cost you, if you shoot a day that you don't need on even a small feature, that's like, $50,000 to $100,000 down the drain. That, it hurts to cut it, and I edit my own movies, but I've cut scenes that I know, well, that cost us $50,000. I wish I'd known that I didn't need that on paper before we went and spent a day shooting it. With fiction, you can, there's a couple things I wrote for this that, went off to the side, and eventually I decided I don't need that and chopped them off, but it was just the time and the money. The effort of doing it. But I do feel like if I don't have any idea of where I'm going, it doesn't go very well. So one of the things that I had with this was I actually had a structure given to me by the history. I have the history of the Wilmington riot, and you meet a lot of people who were real people who were involved in it, as well as characters I've made up. I had the regimental histories of the 25th Infantry Regulars and the Colorado Volunteers who both show up in this, and I pretty much religiously stay with that. So, I was able to say, well, history has told me where these people are gonna go and what happened there. Now I can figure out who do I want to put there and what's gonna happen to them individually. And that's useful sometimes. I've sometimes put a fake spine in a book to hang it on. One of my novels, Union Dues, I always had as the spine Heidi. And Heidi is this little girl, and she's looking for, at least the movie, the Shirley Temple movie, she's always looking for her grandfather. And whenever he goes out the back door, she comes in the front door, and vice versa. And I have a thing with a father and son in Union Dues where the father's looking for the son, and the reader knows, oh, just wait a minute, kid, Dad's about to be there, but then the kid leaves and the father misses him. Very often, what's useful is to have a spine that then disappears, and then you actually may pull it out, but the book has a structure. There's a famous incident of William Friedkin, who made what's the one, the French Connection, where he cut that great scene where there's a long chase that takes, several minutes. He cut it to, a great rock song, and then decided that was too on the nose, and then took that song out and put other music in it. I've done that in movies where I cut a scene in Baby It's You to Don't Mess with Bill, and it's a kind of face-off thing, and I actually played it while the characters were walking into the cafeteria for a showdown, and then it was just too on the money when I edited it, so I took the song out, but it still has a great rhythm to it. Santana, it was a Santana song, I think, called Black Sabbath Woman that he cut into. So if you ever see the movie again, play that song with it.
Hi, my favorite movie of yours is actually Men with Guns.
Oh, thank you.
And which I thought was brilliant. And I see a parallel between that and in this book, as well as your book, Los Gusanos, where it examines the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America. Mm-hmm. And one thing I wondered is whether you feel like with that movie version of it and with the book versions of it, whether you feel like you're able to reach the audience, an American audience, with the sort of message that you're wanting them to absorb from that.
Well, you reach the people who go to the movie, but that's not many people in the case of an independent movie. I think the main thing that Men with Guns and Amigo, our new movie, have in common is that it's about the people who are caught between in a war. In most wars, more non-combatants die than combatants. And that's just war. And it may be from starvation because they can't plow their fields. The soldiers take all their food, kill their, in the case of, the U.S. and the Philippines start killing their carabao, so they have to come to the U.S. and live in a prescribed area and eat canned food. And they're not used to it is killing the soldiers, and so it's killing the civilians too. Men with Guns is about no matter who you are, if there's a war going on and you live in a small place, you don't want to see men with guns show up on your doorstep because it's bad for you. And it doesn't matter which side it is. And that was true of the Hamlets in Vietnam, and it was true of the barrios in the Philippines. Amigo, the movie that's going to come out in the States in August, the Amigo of the title is the cabeza de barrio, the mayor of a little town that is being garrisoned by U.S. troops. They're literally living in his hut. They expect him to keep his people in line at the same time that his brother is the head of the guerrillas who are fighting against the American troops, hiding out in the woods just beyond the rice fields. And hundreds, if not thousands, of those cabezas de barrio, those mayors, were killed by one side or the other in that conflict. So I'm interested in, war movies are usually about the guys carrying the guns. So in A Moment in the Sun, you meet the guys carrying the guns, but you also meet a lot of the people who are in between, who are just caught in the crossfire and wish it would stop.
I've got two questions. The first one is that it's obvious to me from both your movies as well as most of your novels, apparently, that you've not just got a love for history, you have a passion for it. And I'm wondering if in your early life or in your childhood, was there any particular event or person that stimulated that tremendous interest? That's the first question. Mm-hmm. The second question is, in May 1, you played a hard-shell Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. Very, very well, I might add. Thanks. And I didn't know if that was the only film you had done that in, and whether or not that gave you a special perspective that helped you with your directing.
I'll answer the second one first. I've been in maybe a half dozen of movies or more, playing different parts. I usually play people who don't have an arc. You know, the hardest thing in movie acting is that you shoot out of order, and to keep track of where am I now, am I assimilated, am I happy, am I sad, what am I miserable? So I usually play characters who are the same guy they are at the beginning as the end. I played some pretty big characters. In City of Hope, I play a guy who's a jerk, but he's the same jerk throughout the whole movie. And I've been in some other people's movies as well. And I find acting a really, really good kind of cross-training for writing. And the make one thing is like the perfect director part. You just shout things out and everybody says amen. It's perfect for a director. The first question was about
your passion for history.
yeah, you know, it's interesting. I never took a history course in my life. You know, they gave us kind of history and social studies class in high school, and it was kind of interesting. I think I got interested in the story part of history. I was raised Catholic, and hearing the New Testament and the Gospels every Sunday. There were good stories there. Saw a lot of movies that were historically based, if not very accurate. And I do remember in the 60s reading Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee. And really, really well-written, interesting book. And every chapter, I would say, wait a minute, I saw that movie. You know, Charles Bronson played Captain Jack in that movie, or somebody else played Geronimo in that movie. And what really struck me was that the stories, the real history stories in that, were better than the movies. And I kept saying, well, why didn't they use that for the movie? Why didn't they? It's much more involved. It's much more textured than the usual black hat, white hat thing that they do in the movies. So I think that kind of started me thinking about, you know, if you learn about what went on, there's a lot of really interesting stories there. And what I'm interested in those stories is not the surface, and it's kind of the key to what always interests me with fiction, which is if people are acting this way, what can possibly be going on in their heads? And for a period novel like this, you know, set in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you always have to rethink your characters. You know, when you write something, it's, okay, is this before or after Freud? You know, that really affected the way that people all over the world interpreted each other's behavior. Is this before or after the women's movement? Before or after slavery? Before or after capitalism, if you're going back far enough? You know, and that applies to technical things. It's not just, you know, it's not just people's worldview. It could be medicine. One of the characters in this is a physician. And so I had to read medical textbooks from 1900 to really understand his world and what he could do and what he would know and what the philosophy of care was back then. So one of the things that I tried to get at in A Moment in the Sun is not just what happened, but what people thought was happening. And that's a combination of two things. One is, what were the media of the time, and what was the media telling them was going on? Because they didn't have soldiers texting them from the Philippines like people can now, where it's harder to lie. You can still lie, you know, if you're in a newspaper business, but it's harder to get away with it for a long time. And also, what was the mindset of the time? You know, and I talked about race being the link between the two, you know, big parts of the story. 1900 was an incredibly racialized time. All the humor, a lot of the philosophy was racial. When we got into the war in the Philippines, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called "Pick Up the White Man's Burden." And the subtitle of the poem is "The United States and the Philippines." And it's his open letter to the United States saying, we Brits have carried the ball far enough. It's America, this young country's white Christian duty, not opportunity, but duty, to sort these little brown buggers out. And those silent, sullen people will thank your gods and you. Professors were coming out with eugenics, these things that later showed up in Nazi Germany as a philosophy. That was starting right about this time. So when you look at what people did, you can't think, oh, they're just like me, and they're making really bad choices or doing kind of outrageous things. You have to, they're not just like me. You know, where they started, how they understood the world, and the information available to them was very different than what we have available to us now.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have one more question, and then we're going to start the signing. So make it good.
You mentioned the expense and the complexity of filmmaking and cutting one day and $100,000. What's your view of some of the newer trends in filmmaking, digital, the Red One camera, people making films on their iPhones, and YouTube and all that kind of stuff?
It's all storytelling, and I would say that another difference between movie making and writing a book is anything that I do in a book, if I make you feel something, know something, wonder something, whatever, it has to go through your head first. You have to read it and interpret it in a certain way. Movies work on an intellectual but also a really visceral level. So there's all these things that you add to a movie. Some of it's just rhythm, but some of it's sound effects and vibration and music and these things that just get you in the gut or go right to your spine. So each of those ways of telling a story, whether it's a telephone that turns into a camera or whatever, has its own attributes. Early digital, it was hard to narrow the focus. Early digital, everything was in focus. And one of the things that you try to do when you're telling stories with pictures is narrow the focus so the audience only sees or pays attention to the thing that you want them to pay. Now that we just shot Amigo on a red camera, which is a digital camera. It's basically a computer with lenses on it. But the lenses are now film lenses, and you can control that kind of thing. You can't control some other things, so there's a couple shots in it that I'm not crazy about. They're okay, nobody will notice them, but I'm not crazy about them. So what I think is when you're telling a story, a visual story now, you have these things available to you. If for whatever reason you have to use the cheapest, what you have to do is say, okay, here's what this can do well. Maybe I have to tell my story with no adverbs, or whatever that equivalent would be in fiction. Maybe I have to limit myself to these visuals. Does that work for the story I want to tell? If it really doesn't, maybe you want to wait on that story and tell another story that particular method is good for. There are stories that tell very well if they're just kind of found. They're almost like a documentary. There's a lot of background sound and everything like that. There are others where you really, a creepy horror movie, there's such control that we're used to in a creepy horror movie of the soundtrack, of the, that kind of tension, that unless you have a lot of money to redo the sound and redo all the sound, you're not going to get a very good thing from a cheap digital camera. So it is possible to make a good story on any of those media. It's just that you really have to find what does this thing do well, and does that fit with the story that I'm telling. Thanks, everybody. I'll sign over next time.
Okay, for the signing, if we could please form a line on this side of the room here. And then we're going to do books first, and then other things.